A surname can survive the fall of a kingdom, the disappearance of a language, and the redrawing of an entire map. But there is something even stranger about some Irish family names. Their roots reach back to a world that existed before the political state most people now call Britain. That statement needs one important clarification. Britain, as a geographical island, is vastly older than any surname. But the political kingdom of Great Britain did not exist until 1707, when England and Scotland were united under one parliament and one kingdom. The Irish surnames in this story are older than that political Britain by centuries, and some of them were already carrying the memory of kings, warriors, territories, and ancient Gaelic dynasties, when England and Scotland were still separate kingdoms. The remarkable part is not simply that these names are old. It is that many of them were never originally designed to be surnames at all. They began as descriptions of ancestry. A man's name could tell you who his father was, which grandfather mattered, which dynasty he belonged to, or which ancient family had once controlled the land beneath his feet. In medieval Ireland, a name could function almost like a passport, a political declaration, and a family archive compressed into a few syllables. The prefixes tell part of the story. O, originally written as Ua, carried the sense of descendant or grandson. Mac meant son of. These were not decorative additions. They described relationships, and over generations, those relationships hardened into hereditary family names. By roughly the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, hereditary family names had become widespread in Ireland. That makes the history of an Irish surname surprisingly intimate. You are not simply looking at a word. You are looking at a fragment of a family tree. And behind 10 familiar names lies a history of high kings, provincial kingdoms, Viking attacks, Norman invasion, Gaelic resistance, plantation, exile, religious conflict, and cultural survival. The first name takes us into the heart of medieval Munster, where one of Ireland's most famous kings transformed a personal name into a dynasty. O'Brien. The Irish form is O'Brien, meaning descendant of Brian. The Brian in question was not an obscure medieval landowner. He was Brian Boru, the ruler remembered as one of the most powerful kings in Irish history. Brian Boru's rise changed the political landscape of Ireland. He belonged to the Dal Gachas of what is now County Clare, and became King of Munster, before eventually becoming High King. His career culminated at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where forces associated with Brian defeated an opposing coalition. But the popular image of Clontarf can be misleading. It was not simply an Irish army marching against a Viking army. The forces on both sides were politically complicated, and Norse settlers had been integrated into Irish society for generations. Dublin itself was a major Norse-Irish centre. Clontarf was part of a struggle for political dominance in Ireland, involving Irish kings and Norse Gaelic powers. Brian died after the battle, but his name did not disappear with him. It became the foundation of one of Ireland's great dynasties. The O'Briens would remain associated with Thomond, the Gaelic kingdom covering much of North Munster. Their territory became so closely connected with the family that later sources referred to it as O'Brien's country. That is the first great surprise about the name. O'Brien was not simply the surname of Brian Boru's direct children. It became the hereditary identity of a much larger political lineage. And centuries later, the family would find itself confronting a completely different Ireland. The medieval Gaelic political order was being challenged by Anglo-Norman expansion, English royal authority, and eventually, Tudor attempts to bring Ireland under tighter control. Some O'Briens fought. Others negotiated. Some surrendered political titles and received English ones in return. Murrow O'Brien, for example, surrendered his kingdom to Henry Feat and was created Earl of Thomond. The transformation was enormous. A Gaelic king was being incorporated into an English aristocratic system. But the old identity did not vanish. Later, O'Briens fought for the Stuart cause, and, after the defeat of James II, some entered continental European military service. The Irish Brigade in France became one of the destinations for Gaelic soldiers, whose political world had been destroyed at home. A surname that began in the age of Brian Boru had crossed into the age of European dynastic warfare, and that pattern is going to repeat, because the next name belonged to a dynasty that once dominated an enormous part of Northern Ireland. O'Neill. O'Neill means descendant of Neil, but the history behind that word is much older than the surname itself. The O'Neill dynasty became associated with the Hugh O'Neill, the descendants of Neil, and one of the most powerful groupings in medieval Ireland. The northern branch, particularly the Chonaill Neogain, became dominant across territories, corresponding broadly to parts of modern Tyrone, Derry, and Donegal. The name Niall itself was associated with the meaning champion, and one of the key historical figures behind the later surname was Niall Glunduv, a 9th century Irish king who died fighting the Norse near Dublin in 919. According to historical tradition, his grandson, Domhnall O'Neill, is identified as the first person to bear the surname O'Neill. That is extraordinary because it reveals something fundamental about medieval surnames. A family name did not necessarily appear when the ancestor lived. The ancestor could exist first, the dynasty could become powerful second, and only later could his descendant turn that ancestral name into a hereditary surname. For centuries, the O'Neills were not merely a family living somewhere in Ireland. They were a political force. The territory of Tír Eochain took its name from Eogan, traditionally identified as a son of Niall of the Nine Hostages, and the O'Neills became kings of Ulster. Their story eventually reaches one of the most dramatic episodes in Irish history, the 9 Years' War at the end of the 16th century. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, became the central Gaelic leader resisting the expansion of English authority in Ulster. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. The Gaelic forces were defeated. Hugh O'Neill eventually left Ireland in the Flight of the Earls in 1607, beginning a new chapter in which the old Gaelic aristocracy increasingly found itself separated from the political world that had produced it. But the name remained. The dynasty had lost its kingdom. The surname survived. And that distinction is crucial. Political power can disappear overnight. A surname can survive for another 400 years. The next name carries another kind of royal memory. O'Connor. O'Conchobair means descendant of Conchobair, an ancient personal name associated with ideas such as high will or desire. But the surname does not point to one single family. There were multiple distinct O'Connor lineages in Ireland. The most famous were the O'Connors of Connacht, who became the ruling dynasty of that province and produced kings who claimed the title of High King of Ireland. This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. When people hear O'Connor, they often imagine one giant family stretching backward in an unbroken line. Medieval Ireland was more complicated. Different families could share the same ancestral personal name and develop separate hereditary identities. The O'Connors of Connacht themselves divided into branches, including the O'Connor Don, the O'Connor Ruad, and the O'Connor Sligo. The name therefore tells us something about the structure of Gaelic society. It is not always a single bloodline. Sometimes it is a political lineage. Sometimes several families carried the same surname, and sometimes an ancient name became so widespread that its original geographic meaning was almost impossible to reconstruct from the modern surname alone. Yet the O'Connors had something few families could claim. Their ancestors had occupied the highest level of Irish kingship. The dynasty's struggle for power was not merely about land. It was about the old Gaelic concept of legitimate rule. Then came the Anglo-Norman invasion. Ireland's political balance changed. Norman castles appeared. New lordships emerged. Some Gaelic kingdoms survived for centuries, but the political map became increasingly fractured. The O'Connors adapted, resisted, negotiated, and survived. And their name eventually became one of the most recognizable Irish surnames anywhere in the world. But if O'Connor demonstrates how one name could belong to several ancient dynasties, the next surname reveals how closely a family name could be tied to a particular province. McCarthy. The Irish form is MacCarthy, meaning son of Carthach. Carthach was an early medieval personal name, and the McCarthy dynasty became one of the dominant Gaelic families of Munster. Their story is tied to the political fragmentation of Southern Ireland and the rise of rival branches of the dynasty. The McCarthys were not merely farmers who happened to acquire an old surname. They were kings and princes within the Gaelic political order. The family became especially associated with Desmond and southern Munster, and different branches controlled different territories. The name itself is a perfect example of why the word Mac matters. Mac did not originally mean a permanent family label. It meant son. But when generations continued to identify themselves through a famous ancestor, the relationship became hereditary. A phrase meaning son of Carthach became McCarthy. And once written into records, legal documents, genealogies, and land transactions, the name could outlive the original relationship. The McCarthys also illustrate another reality of Irish history. The arrival of the Anglo-Normans did not simply replace Gaelic families. In many places, Gaelic dynasties survived for centuries, alongside Norman families, sometimes fighting them, sometimes intermarrying with them, and sometimes adopting aspects of the new political order. Munster became a complicated frontier between Gaelic lordships and Anglo-Norman territories. The McCarthys remained powerful in that environment. By the 16th and 17th centuries, however, the pressure from the English crown intensified. Traditional Gaelic authority was increasingly incompatible with a centralized Tudor state. The Old World was narrowing, but the name was not. McCarthy eventually became one of the most recognizable Irish surnames outside Ireland, especially through emigration. The remarkable thing is that a name once associated with medieval Munster could eventually be found in London, Paris, New York, Boston, Melbourne, and beyond. The political kingdom disappeared. The family name traveled. Now consider Kelly. It looks simple, almost too simple, but behind Kelly is one of the most widespread surname traditions in Ireland. The Irish form is O'Kelly, generally interpreted as descendant of Cailleach. There were several unrelated or distinct families of the name, which is another reminder that Irish surnames cannot always be treated as a single biological family tree. The name became particularly prominent in areas such as Galway and other parts of Ireland, and by the 19th century, Kelly was already among the country's most common surnames. By 1890, Robert Matheson's official surname statistics placed Kelly second among Irish surnames, behind Murphy. But its modern popularity hides something fascinating. A surname can become common without losing its ancient origins. In fact, the more widespread a surname becomes, the more likely it is that several historical families contributed to the modern population carrying it. That makes names like Kelly less like a single ancient clan and more like branches of an enormous genealogical forest. And this is where Irish surname history becomes more interesting than simple lists of oldest families. The question is not always, how old is this one family? The better question is, how long has this naming tradition existed, and how many different medieval families carried it? Kelly shows why that distinction matters. The next surname takes us north again, into Donegal, where one medieval dynasty built a powerful territorial identity around a name that remains familiar today. O'Donnell. O'Donnell means descendant of Domhnall. The personal name Domhnall is ancient in Gaelic tradition and was associated with several important rulers. The O'Donnells became the leading dynasty of Tir Chonaill, a kingdom centered in what is now County Donegal. For centuries, the O'Donnells controlled a powerful territory in the northwest. Their political world was built around castles, alliances, fosterage, warfare, and a sophisticated network of Gaelic relationships. And then came Hugh Roe O'Donnell. His story reads almost like a historical thriller. As a young man, Hugh Roe was imprisoned by the English authorities in Dublin Castle. He eventually escaped and returned north, where he became a major leader of the Gaelic resistance during the 9 Years' War. The conflict drew together O'Donnell and Hugh O'Neill against the expanding English state. The campaign produced one of the greatest Gaelic victories of the period at the Battle of Yellow Ford in 1598. For a moment, it seemed possible that English control of Ireland might be reversed. Then came Kinsale. The defeat in 1601 shattered the strategic position of the Gaelic leaders. Hugh Roe O'Donnell fled to Spain seeking military assistance, but he died there in 1602. His life had begun inside the ancient Gaelic world of Donegal. It ended in exile on the European mainland. His surname survived the journey. And once again, the pattern appears. The family lost territory. The name gained geography. The next surname carries a similar story of power, but with an especially strong connection to the kingdom of Breifne. O'Rourke. O'Ruarc means descendant of Ruarc. The O'Rourkes were associated with the medieval kingdom of Breifne, a territory covering parts of modern Leitrim and Cavan. The name appears repeatedly in medieval Irish history, and one of the best-known figures was Tigernán Ua Ruarc, ruler of Breifne in the 12th century. His career became entangled in the dramatic political struggles of the period when Diarmait mac Murchada, king of Leinster, sought outside assistance after losing his position. That request helped trigger the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169. The consequences were enormous. What began as a dispute among Irish rulers opened the door to a new military and political power. Norman forces entered Ireland. Strongholds changed hands. New lordships emerged. And the Gaelic kingdoms entered a centuries-long struggle for survival. The O'Rourkes endured through that transformation. Their name remained tied to Breifne and the northwestern Midlands. But this is where one of the most dangerous mistakes in Irish surname history appears. People often imagine medieval Ireland as a collection of neat clans occupying clearly defined territories. The reality was messier. Families split, branches migrated, kings lost land, marriage changed alliances, fosterage created relationships outside direct bloodlines, and political authority could be shared or contested. A surname, therefore, does not always tell you exactly where every ancestor lived. It tells you something about the network from which the family identity emerged, and sometimes that network was much larger than the modern county system suggests. The next name takes us to the mountains and valleys of Wicklow. O'Byrne. O'Broin means descendant of Bran. The O'Byrnes became one of the major Gaelic families of Leinster, especially associated with the rugged territory of Wicklow. Their homeland was close enough to the English-controlled Pale around Dublin to make coexistence difficult. Wicklow's mountains offered a natural defensive landscape. For generations, Gaelic families used that terrain to resist English expansion. The O'Byrnes became particularly famous for their military resistance. In the 16th century, Fiach MacHugh O'Byrne emerged as a formidable Gaelic leader. He used the mountains of Wicklow as a base for raids and resistance against English authority. His position was strategically important. Dublin was not far away. The Pale was the centre of English government in Ireland. Yet beyond its borders, Gaelic lordships retained substantial independence. Fiach MacHugh O'Byrne's forces repeatedly challenged English troops and communications. For the English administration, the problem was not simply that a Gaelic lord refused to submit. It was that the geography itself favored him. Roads were difficult. Mountains provided cover. Local knowledge mattered. And an army accustomed to conventional warfare could struggle against a mobile enemy operating from familiar terrain. Eventually, however, the English crown increased military pressure. Fiach MacHugh O'Byrne died in 1597. The old Gaelic order was approaching its breaking point, but the surname survived. That is the recurring irony of Irish history. The stronger the pressure on the political structure, the more important the family name could become as a surviving marker of identity. Then comes one of the most famous Irish surnames associated with the Atlantic coast, O'Malley. O'Malley means descendant of Mai. The family was associated particularly with County Mayo and the west coast of Ireland, and their history is inseparable from the sea. The name is famously connected with Grace O'Malley, or Granny Mole, the 16th century Gaelic leader whose life became surrounded by legend. She was born into the O'Malley dynasty, a seafaring family with interests along the western coast. The Atlantic was not a boundary for these people. It was a highway. Boats connected islands, coastal settlements, trading points, and territories. The O'Malleys participated in maritime activity, and Grace O'Malley became a powerful figure in her own right. Her story has often been simplified into the image of a pirate queen, but that label can obscure the political reality. She was a Gaelic noblewoman navigating a world in which maritime power, landholding, kinship, and political allegiance were deeply connected. She commanded ships. She negotiated with powerful men. She resisted English attempts to impose greater control over her territory. And according to the well-known tradition, she eventually met Queen Elizabeth I in England. Whether every detail of the famous encounter has been preserved accurately is another matter. But the broader historical reality is remarkable enough. A Gaelic woman from the western coast of Ireland became a political negotiator with the English monarch at the height of Tudor power. Her surname represented a family whose world was built around the Atlantic. The English government could attempt to control Ireland, it could seize land, it could appoint governors, but it could not erase a name simply by issuing a new order. And there was another family in Ireland whose surname became closely associated with the Gaelic aristocracy of Ulster, MacMahon. The Irish form is MacMahon, generally understood as son of Mathchamhain, with the underlying personal name associated with the word for bear. The MacMahons were particularly associated with Monaghan and surrounding areas. They were part of the powerful Gaelic political landscape of Ulster. Their history shows another feature of Irish surnames. The same name could belong to different branches and regional dynasties. One of the most prominent MacMahon lordships was in Oriel, where the family held territory and political authority. But as English power expanded into Ulster, traditional Gaelic lordships came under increasing pressure. The Tudor conquest was not simply a series of battles. It involved surrender and regrant, land confiscation, new administrative structures, English legal systems, and the gradual replacement of Gaelic political authority with a more centralized system controlled by the crown. For families such as the MacMahons, that transformation could mean the difference between ruling a territory and merely owning a fragment of land within someone else's kingdom. Then came the 17th century. Plantation changed the demographic and political landscape of Ulster. The defeat of the Gaelic aristocracy and the flight of the earls accelerated the collapse of the old order. But again, the surname survived. It moved through migration, exile, marriage, military service, and eventually mass emigration. And now we reach the final name. A name so familiar that its ancient political history can easily disappear behind the modern spelling. O'Connell. O'Connell means descendant of Chonaill. The personal name Chonaill is ancient, and several separate families in Ireland carried the surname. One branch was associated with Derry, another with Galway. And the most famous later branch was associated with Kerry. The Kerry O'Connells became connected to the McCarthy political world and held the role of hereditary castellans of Ballycarbery. Then, centuries later, the name became inseparable from one of the most important political movements in 19th century Ireland. Daniel O'Connell. Known as the Liberator, O'Connell became the central figure in the campaign for Catholic political rights and played a decisive role in securing Catholic emancipation in 1829. His career demonstrates how an ancient Gaelic surname could reappear in an entirely new political environment. The medieval kingdom was gone. The clan system had changed. The Gaelic aristocracy had been transformed. But the name remained, and now it was attached not to a medieval king or warrior, but to a modern mass political movement. That is the real secret hidden inside these surnames. They do not simply survive because families refuse to change their names. They survive because names are remarkably adaptable. O'Brien could move from kingship to aristocracy to exile. O'Neill could move from Ulster kingship to continental exile. O'Connor could move from provincial royalty into modern Irish society. McCarthy could move from medieval Munster to a global diaspora. Kelly could spread across Ireland until it became one of the country's most common names. O'Donnell could move from the mountains of Donegal to the wider world. O'Rourke could survive the transformation of Breifne. O'Byrne could carry the memory of Wicklow resistance. O'Malley could preserve the memory of an Atlantic dynasty. MacMahon could outlive the Gaelic political system of Ulster. and O'Connell could transform an old family name into a symbol of 19th-century political nationalism. But there is one final twist. Many people assume that the modern spelling of an Irish surname is ancient. Usually, it isn't. The Irish language forms are often much older than the English spellings. During the centuries when Irish names were being recorded by English-speaking officials, scribes often wrote names phonetically. O'Brien came from O'Brien. O'Neill came from O'Neill. Other names changed even more dramatically. Different spellings could emerge from the same original Irish name, while unrelated Irish names could sometimes end up with similar English forms. This means the spelling on a modern birth certificate may be only the latest layer of a much older story. A family might have written its name in Irish. Then an English official might have written down how it sounded. Later, another clerk might have altered the spelling. An emigrant might simplify it at a port. A census taker might record it differently. And eventually, the version that survived into the 20th century could look completely unlike the medieval original. Even the punctuation can change. The apostrophe in O'Brien or O'Neill is not simply a piece of typography. It is a surviving clue to the old Gaelic O. The same is true of Mac and Mac. They are reminders that these surnames were originally statements about ancestry, and that makes the history of Irish names more profound than the question of whether a surname is older than Britain. Because Britain itself changed names. Kingdoms became unions. Crowns were joined. Parliaments merged. States were created. The political entity called Great Britain began in 1707. But long before that date, Irish families had already been carrying hereditary names across generations, and those names had already survived invasions that were themselves centuries old. The Vikings came. The Normans came. The Tudors came. The Stuarts came. Plantations transformed the land. The old Gaelic aristocracy collapsed. Millions eventually left Ireland, yet the names continued. That is why the oldest Irish surnames are not really monuments to the past. They are evidence that the past never completely disappeared. A surname like O'Brien can contain the memory of Brian Boru. O'Neill can evoke the kings of Ulster. O'Connor can recall the rulers of Connacht. McCarthy can point toward medieval Munster. O'Donnell can lead back to Tir Chonaill. O'Byrne can take you into the mountains of Wicklow. O'Malley can carry you toward the Atlantic coast, and O'Connell can connect a medieval lineage to the political transformation of modern Ireland. The names changed pronunciation. They changed spelling. They changed social status. Their owners crossed oceans. Some became soldiers. Some became politicians. Some became landlords. Some became refugees. Some became famous. Most became ordinary people. And perhaps that is the most astonishing part. The medieval world was built around kings and dynasties, but surnames survived because ordinary people carried them. A child inherited a father's name. That child grew up, had children, and passed it forward again. The process continued through famine, war, conquest, migration, and political revolution. Generation after generation. The kingdom could disappear. The language could be suppressed. The castle could fall. The land could change hands. But somewhere, someone was still writing the family name. That is why calling these surnames older than Britain is ultimately a dramatic shorthand rather than a literal statement about the age of the island itself. The island of Britain is prehistoric. The political kingdom of Great Britain is modern by comparison. And many Irish hereditary surnames emerged during the medieval period, centuries before that kingdom was created. Their real achievement is not that they somehow existed before Britain. It is that they survived every version of Britain that followed. They survived a medieval Ireland divided into kingdoms. They survived the arrival of Anglo-Norman power. They survived Tudor conquest. They survived the destruction of Gaelic political independence. They survived the transformation of land and law. They survived the age of empire. And they crossed the Atlantic when millions of Irish people left their homeland. That is the hidden power of a surname. It is a tiny historical object carried by human beings, a word passed from parent to child, a sound repeated until its original meaning is forgotten. a fragment of medieval Ireland sitting quietly on a modern passport. And sometimes, when you look closely enough, the name tells you that your family history did not begin where the surviving documents begin. It began earlier, in a kingdom that no longer exists, under a language that was once spoken differently, around a castle whose stones may still stand, beside a river whose name has changed, with an ancestor whose personal name became a family name long after he was gone. The political maps of the British Isles have been redrawn again and again. But surnames have their own maps, and those maps are much harder to erase. If your family name has a story worth discovering, subscribe for more forgotten history.